So, this is Nick Knightsbridge. Today's book is The Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz. Here it is. Great book, really eye-opening, as a lot of the books recently have been that I've covered. So, the book's main theme is about the paradox that the more choices we're given, the more stressful life seems to become. First section talks about how choices in our lives have just proliferated. They've grown exponentially, compared to a few decades ago, where we'd have very little choice in terms of choosing utilities or general education. That was really highlighted in the book, that even something as easy as the first 2 years of college has become really complex, because the little example they used was Swarthmore College, that has a population of 1,350, has 120 different classes to meet gen ed requirements, and you're only supposed to choose 9 of them, which is kind of hilarious. 18-year-olds choosing 9 out of 1,350 classes. Well, I'm sure really depends on your interests and what kind of area you're going into. However, these are general education classes. Kind of crazy. Another thing I just touched on was the utilities. Now we can choose between so many different electrical providers and phone companies, whatnot, whereas before it was very much limited to whatever the city is catering for in your neighborhood. So the choices now are really daunting, and adding basically to people's plates that are not so good with decisions, obviously. Next section is kind of really coming off of, the last section is talking about how the myriad of decisions we have to make every day adds to our stress. Interesting quote by Albert Camus, who was a French existentialist philosopher, said once, and I quote, "Should I kill myself or have a cup of coffee?" End quote. I always like that one because really highlights the fact that even kind of hugely different choices, we still have to make decisions every day. Just highlighting that essentially. And what Mr. Schwartz, the author, was alluding to in this section of the book is how most people are really ill-equipped to make decisions on complex things. I mean, it's all fine and dandy to choose between a cup of coffee or a latte or whatnot at Starbucks. But if you have to make really important kind of life choices regarding the complex things such as health insurance or retirement plans, etc., things like that, most people feel ill-equipped to make those choices, and it really adds to their stress, obviously. And of course, if you make the wrong choice, it can really cost you. The wrong retirement plan might mean kind of essentially destitute poverty for the golden years of your life, or the wrong insurance plan. And if you've ever chosen an insurance policy, which I'm sure most of you have, and you get something that's akin to the Bible through the mail, and you have to go through so much to see what's covered, what's not covered. Of course, with Obamacare, made things a little bit easier. Pre-existing conditions had to be covered, etc., things like that. But still, there's a lot of paperwork because, of course, unfortunately, our insurance companies, the only ones in the developed world, are run-for-profit corporations, which means their final allegiance is to the board and to shareholders, not the sick people who need their help in getting better. So basically, choose the wrong policy, and you're not covered, and it could cost you big. I mean, most Europeans probably freak out when they hear about the kind of prices we have to pay in American hospitals. But a day in the ER can cost you like $5,000 to $25,000. So yeah, kind of in a week you could be bankrupt. And with most Americans having very little savings, living paycheck to paycheck, it's kind of a really hard bullet to bite. So the stakes are huge, needless to say. Next section actually touches on a previous book, or rather a previous author I've covered, Daniel Kahneman, and how he talks about the fact that memories are formed really not by the overall experience, but rather the highs and the lows, and with particular emphasis being put on the ending. So if things were pretty good for most of it, but one bad thing during the experience, and that occurred at the end, you're overwhelmingly likely to remember this as a bad experience, even though the majority might have been good. So and that's obviously if any of you guys checked out that if you know any of Daniel Kahneman's works, basically he argued that memories were formed mostly after the fact. So, and that's why they're not really reliable. So yeah, and so a segue from there is that this author, Barry Schwartz and Kahneman, allude to the fact that because memories are unreliable and they're formed after the fact, it kind of highlights how people are not so great with choices, and the more they're presented with, the less likely they are to be happy with the choice they finally make. Because the more choices you have, the more you're worried about making the wrong choice, obviously. And that nicely slips us into the next section, which is about opportunity cost, as the author puts it. And that's all about essentially worrying about what could have been. So, a vacation in the tropics that you want to choose, or vacation to New York City, going to the tropics, the opportunity cost is seeing Times Square. So the fact that you're going to miss out on going to New York. So this is a big problem for many people, and it's a study actually that was in the book regarding magazine choices found that basically the more options you give people, the less likely they were to make a choice. When a magazine was chosen and they could see the other options, people tended to be more happier with the choice they went. But if they didn't know which other options were available, they would feel like they're missing out, and so essentially their pleasure from the final choice would be less in that case, because they would think there's something better out there. Next section talks about essentially what I'd call the novelty effect, or rather adaptation, as the author puts it. Basically, how something new and great isn't so new and great anymore after you've had it for a while. Human beings have a nature just to, get tired of things they have, and it's probably for evolutionary reasons. I mean, imagine if we were happy with the basics, we'd never amount to really anything, And I guess delayed gratification is the basis of that people can plan out their future and their life, I guess, separates us from the animals. That we can wait for the fruits of our labor to be born later. We don't need them immediately. And of course, if we received something that was great, or something we were totally happy about, and it was enough for us, well, we'd never amount to much more than that, So probably wouldn't have modern society, in fact, if it wasn't for this effect. But nevertheless, we get used to things, and we kind of return back to a set point of happiness. The author refers to this as hedonic adaptation, so essentially adaptation to pleasure. So more examples could be a first-time visitor to a big city might be overwhelmed and love all the options available, but second and third time obviously less so. And someone native to the city probably obviously wouldn't get overwhelmed, and they just accept the choices because that's where they live. You could argue the same for drugs and alcohol. The effect, to get the same effect, you need to keep upping the dosage. That's a obviously well-known in psychobiology. Another interesting fact that they point out in the book was that people who won state lotteries within the last year, if you went back to them and asked them how happy you were, they aren't as happy as the general population. And even people that became paraplegic or quadriplegic, they consider themselves happy. Although, of course, it did point out that less happy than the average person, though still happy. So, nevertheless, it points to the fact that we have a set point that we go back to as human beings. Next section just highlights more of the fact that unhappiness is really endemic in modern society, and how this section I was a little bit sketchy about. Wasn't so certain of, but the author, I guess, points to correlation. I'll explain to you guys in a second what I mean by that. He talks about how American GDP, and I guess because the book, isn't really aimed at millennial generation. He's talking probably to people, like 40 plus. Nevertheless, he talks about how GDP has grown by leaps and bounds, though happiness seems to have come down, and they put it down to they actually came up with a happiness quotient. So there is positive correlation between unhappiness and income, which leads people to have more free time, which means that they have even more choices. Now, it'd be great to actually get the full stats on the studies or whatnot. Maybe that's just me. I like to nitpick. A little bit too many statistical mathematics classes maybe back in college, but nevertheless, there seems to be a positive correlation, and in these studies, that more choices, more money, more choices, more time do not seem to be conducive to happiness. So they rather point in the opposite direction. And even Martin Seligman, who's a psychologist, well-known psychologist, is quoted in the book as saying that a failure and a lack of control leads to depression. And I guess the author is arguing that because more choices are afforded to us, you can't really blame anyone else if you make the wrong choice. And so the pressure just keeps building up, and people think that they really can't resort to anyone else because if things go wrong, whereas before it was kind of taken care of for us by Big Brother, so to speak, if you could argue that how modern society has been really correlated, you could say, kind of meshed with having more choices and more democracy and more free market, economics seems to just give us more choice, but that's not necessarily a good thing, and that's not good for our health or anything else, it seems. So, next section, the author refers to maximizers. He comes up with a term that these are basically people that have to have the absolute best in everything. So they spend a lot of energy and time to consider all the options. They essentially can't see one thing that they like and just settle for it. They have to know on every possible other option that may be out there that might be better, that probably is better. And they're always looking for a better deal, essentially. And if one doesn't actually exist, they will come up with hypothetical scenarios where others exist. For example, a dress that they bought for, $30, that's the right color, that's the right fit, everything is great, but they're wondering if they could get the same thing for $20 or $10 or $5 if they keep looking. And if they don't find it, even if there's no evidence to the contrary, they are more likely to believe that that dress is out there, that cheaper secondary dress that they couldn't get, or jeans or food options or whatever you can think of, essentially all products. And this is really emotionally exhausting, taxing on people. And these people are much more likely to suffer from buyer's remorse because they're convinced that something better is out there. So what might have been is really kind of a question that lingers in these kind of people's head. And I have to admit that I'm kind of susceptible to this, and learning a lot from for myself reading this book. Now the next section talks about the exact contra to maximizers, and they are satisficers. If I said that right, it's CER at the end. Don't know why he didn't go with ZER, but satisficer. But so satisficers are people who settle for good enough, quote unquote. So what does that entail? What kind of person, you may ask, is a satisficer? Well, quite the opposite of a maximizer. So satisficers only seek to achieve their criteria. Maximizers are always in search of the best deal, which of course is more and more elusive. Satisficers only have to kind of see everything in two categories. One, that it meets their standard or standards, or another item or something else, or everything else essentially that doesn't meet their standards. So it's pretty easy to satisfy them. If they come up to if they find the first product that meets their standards, so it's got the right fit, right color, right price, it's good enough. They'll buy it and they won't worry about what other choices are out there. And they're generally happier with their choices and happy about life in general, as well as much less likely to suffer from buyer's remorse or anything like that. I really need to buy my mom this book, I think. All right, so what's great news out there for those of you who've labeled yourselves already as maximizers? Put the knife down. There is a way out of this. So basically, if you start to think that if you accept that really the best is elusive and not really attainable, that really helps. If you stop worrying about what could be, or what else could be out there, if you just look at what's in your hand, and if it's within the parameters, you should go for it and not worry about anything else. I mean, easier said than done, absolutely. But we need to accept, me too, I'm in this boat, that the best is unattainable, excuse me. So yeah, talking to myself here. All right, next section and last section is commitment to other people. Now, something that wasn't in the book that I recall from a study a few years back, I think it was in the New York Times, that said essentially they found that control for for all other factors, people in relationships, married people in fact, live, I believe it was 2 to 5 years longer than unmarried people. Now I'm sure that there were they looked at the length of time they were together. Relationships, of course, are not your whole life, whole adult life, but whatever is the case, people in committed relationships, contrary to what you would believe with all the arguments you have with relatives on Thanksgiving, married people seem to be happier long term and generally in better health over the course of their lives. So why is that? Well, author argues that stable and committed social relationships increase your well-being. Now, I guess this is, of course, kind of hinting at the fact that we are social creatures. We do like to feel that we belong. We do like to feel that we're part of a social net, a group, and even with the fact that in when it comes to at least relationships, we have to accept certain constraints. We can't go and have sex with anyone else we want, or date anyone, etc. There are obvious constraints in most, I would say. Of course, some relationships are a little bit outside the standards or norms or what's common in relationships, but at least most relationships come with certain constraints. And even with those constraints accepted, people seem to be happier when they have these kind of four walls. I mean, the average person, that is, of course. We all know that some unorthodox relationships also work. We have swingers out there. You have love triangles, etc. But for the most part, the constraints, or at least the constraints that you've come up with your significant other, seem to help people be more happy and feel as if they're more part of a social group, whatever that may be. Example they use actually was the Amish. Obviously, we all know that the Amish have a lot of restrictions on their lives, and they're kind of living essentially in 18th/19th century lives with their dislike, or rather aversion to technology, etc. They still study shows that they're 20% less likely to suffer from any kind of depression. So really, I mean, it goes to show that what we may think about choices is not necessarily the case. So you guys may ask yourself, how do I find this happen? Well, first read the book. But just a little tidbit. Essentially, what the author is arguing, or rather trying to convey to us, is we have to adhere to certain rules and limitations in our choice, and that way we'll reduce kind of the stress, psychological stress, and the less choices, the easier it gets, and the more happy we shall be. Or so goes the theory. So that's my review for The Paradox of Choice. This is Nick Knightsbridge. Bye, guys.